Winter has come for those living in Westeros as the White Walkers begin their descent towards civilization with the sole objective of wiping out all life in the land, like a frosty plague. They're also particularly difficult to kill, and they now have an ice dragon, so, the odds are sorta stacked on their side. But what if all of this was Ned Stark's fault? Let's dive in to see if he's the one responsible for everyone's troubles in Season 8 of Game of Thrones. One of the key phrases associated with Game of Thrones is "winter is coming," and rightly so. It's become a meme and has been integrated into pop culture's lexicon. But there's another, if not more important line that features in the show and novels. There must always be a Stark at Winterfell, are words to live by according to Ned Stark, and a lesson he instills into his children and Jon Snow. Catelyn even says it to Robb at one point. Basically, it means that sometimes you have to put your personal honor aside and reside at Winterfell, regardless as to what's going on in the world. The Starks are known as Wardens of the North and command huge respect and loyalty up until the point where the show really kicks into gear. They have dozens of houses sworn to them and are the dominant ruling family in the Northern Realms. So of course there has to be a Stark there to govern all of that. So how did this belief come to pass? We don't know for sure, but there's a sure bet that since the Starks feel a deep connection to Winterfell, it must stem from the origins of the settlement thousands of years prior to the events in the show. These events are what fans are hoping to see in the upcoming spin-off series starring Naomi Watts. While many fans believe that the series will be named The Long Night, nothing has been confirmed as of yet. During that period in time, thousands of years before the White Walkers rose again, Bran the Builder supposedly built Winterfell and the Wall, and instilled a mindset that would last thousands of years. All of this took place in the Age of Heroes, and during the Long Night. It's worth noting that the northern settlements, especially Winterfell, are some of the oldest places in all of Westeros. So what exactly was the Long Night? The Long Night was pretty much the worst thing ever for Westeros. First up, there was a winter that lasted an entire generation. And you think 5 months is bad if you live in a cold, wintry environment. With a winter that lasted that long, many crops died, and the people starved, assuming they didn't freeze to death first. But it gets worse. This is when the White Walkers first descended from the north, and they were loving this whole long winter thing going on, as they seek to cover the whole world with darkness and cold. The White Walkers were in turn experimented humans, or first men, that the children of the forest created with the objective of protecting the children from the invading men. But of course, all crazy and mad experiments ultimately escaped their bonds in these kinds of settings, and so the Walkers ended up on the loose to terrorize freely. What followed next was something called the War of the Dawn, which saw the first men and the children of the forest ultimately putting aside their differences and forming an alliance to take on the Walkers, who could reanimate the dead and create a terrifying enemy. By using fire and dragonglass, the Alliance fought a long and bloody war. The site of the conflict is unknown, but thanks to some hints and implications, many believe that the site of the war, or at least some of the key battles, was at Winterfell, and is why Bran the Builder decided to raise a city over the victorious battlegrounds. Hence the name of the settlement, Winterfell, implying that yes, this is where the forces of cold and darkness ultimately met their defeat. Not only did Bran the Builder build Winterfell, but helped the children of the forest build the Wall, using special enchantments to help keep the Walkers out of the civilized world. Seeing as this takes place around 8,000 years before Jon, Daenerys, or Tyrion were even born, this tale is largely seen as a fairy tale, or a story that isn't meant to be taken as historical fact anymore. So if the Wall was built using magic to ward off the Walkers, and Bran was supposedly one of the heroic figures working on it, could we not assume that the closest capital settlement wouldn't get similar treatment? Especially when one considers that Bran also built the original Winterfell, especially if Winterfell is the site of the War of the Dawn. Logically, if the Walker threat was as bad as it was, and we know how bad it can be, then Winterfell may actually act as a secondary line of defense in case the Wall should ever fall. And as we know, thanks to the finale of Season 7, that wall did fall, in spectacular fashion. So where do the Starks come into play? Well, we've talked about Bran the Builder before, but we've held back the information that he was actually the founder of House Stark, and was the first king in the North. And if Bran and the Children of the Forest built the Wall to keep the Walkers out, then one has to assume that the Walkers weren't attacking on the regular during the construction of the Wall, or else they'd never have finished. So something keeping them at bay is a safe assumption. It's likely that they were actually subdued thanks to the magic of Winterfell, which was actually keeping them trapped or asleep during the construction of the Wall, and for the 8,000 years that followed. The key to keeping that magic in check? Well, there's no definitive proof anywhere, hence why this is a theory, but it seems very possible that the magic is bound by a Stark being in Winterfell. If that's the case, then the blame can lie squarely on Ned Stark's shoulders. But let's back up a little bit. Not long before the events of the first Game of Thrones, a few decades give or take, there was a tourney, or tournament, where knights and warriors from many noble families came to compete. It was said to be the biggest tourney of all time, and despite all the grandeur of the event, Prince Rhaegar Targaryen was very open with his flirtations to Lyanna Stark, Ned's sister. The only thing is that Lyanna was engaged to be married to Robert Baratheon, and Rhaegar was married to Elia Martell. Awkward. Meanwhile, in the north, the Wildlings began banding together in order to move further south in order to move away from a sudden menace. This is explored more in the book, so you won't find that information in the show. The books never explicitly mention if it was 15 years before the events of the first novel, which is when the tourney happened, but we do know the Walkers were mobilizing long before we see them in the opening of the book and show. So why did the Walkers suddenly wake up? Well, interestingly enough, all the Starks were present for the tourney, which was located at Harrenhal. Mara Reed tells young Bran Stark about the tourney and recounts through historical documents that Ned, Benjen, Lyanna, and Brandon were all in attendance, which means we can assume that their parents were also at this grand event. So in other words, there wasn't a Stark residing in Winterfell during the tourney, which would ultimately launch Robert's rebellion. Now, it's likely that the magic that surrounds Winterfell isn't locked specifically to Winterfell, or else the Starks would basically be in house arrest for all eternity. But Winterfell is a beacon for the North, and it's likely that the magic encompasses much of the North, which is critical as Harrenhal is in the South, and outside of the domain of the magic of the North. With all the Starks tucked away in the South being entertained by a tournament that would ultimately launch a war, the White Walkers, who had passed into myth, suddenly woke up, and no one was the wiser except for the uncivilized wildlings of the far north. From there, the Night King and his followers began reorganizing over the years, and began moving south, claiming wildlings and turning them into whites, until they were strong enough to make their move. Of course, when they got closer to the Wall, no one actually believed the stories, due to the belief that the Walkers were mythical beings. So the warnings were not taken seriously, until it was too late. So what happens now? The Starks have been in and out of Winterfell throughout the show, with the children leaving the stronghold, Robb launching his own war, and Ramsay Snow taking hold of Winterfell while everyone's backs were turned. Now that Jon, Sansa, and Arya are back in Winterfell, though, nothing has happened. No great magic has put the Night King and his forces back in his place. It would appear that once the spell has been broken, that's it until it can be reset. And now that the Night King has an ice dragon on his side, the odds are definitely stacked against our heroes. So while the Night King is still coming, all is not lost for our heroes. While the North was once in shambles and plagued by war and conflict, we're looking at you, Ramsay, things are a little different now. There is more than one Stark in Winterfell now, and the North has united once again under their banner. This show of unity and strength is already a plus for the side of the living. Furthermore, unlike the Boltons, Sansa and Jon have grown up hearing that winter is coming, and after its delay, they knew that the coming cold would be a much longer winter, one that may even rival the long night, so they began preparing for it, such as lining their armors with fur and likely dealing with food stocks in a more efficient and practical manner, as a harvest will be impossible now, and trade with the South for the time being doesn't seem too likely. The key here is that the first men and the children of the forest beat the Walkers once before, so that tells us right away that it is possible once again. With the wall down, it looks like Winterfell or the lands around it may play host to yet another epic battle. This time around, though, the forces of darkness have a dragon and huge numbers, while the heroes barely have enough dragon glass to arm themselves. Fire will likely be very important, and that's where Dany's last two dragons come to play. Even more interesting is Bran Stark. He's now the three-eyed raven, and has the ability to possess animals and even people now. Could he get inside the head of the Night King? Of all the characters in the show, Bran is certainly one of the most magical, after all those involved with the Lord of Light. Once everything is said and done, perhaps Bran Stark will become the new Bran the Builder. He's already met with the Children of the Forest, and he's named after Bran the Builder. Perhaps he'll be the one responsible for recasting the magical spells, and for the creation of a second wall, assuming they even need a second wall. For all we know, the Night King and his threat will be utterly destroyed, and Westeros will have no need for a wall in the Night's Watch. Their watch may very well be over once this is said and done. But if it's not, and the Walkers are only defeated and retreat to the north, the defenses will have to be restored. that much is for certain. While Ned Stark may not have physically created the walkers themselves, this theory does suggest that by simply having all of the Starks away from Winterfell at the same time, the walkers were able to break free of their imprisonment. The Starks likely had no idea that not leaving a Stark behind would have such dire consequences. But here we are, one wall down and an ice dragon on the loose. The timing of the Wildlings mobilizing may not be clear, but we know it was not long after the events of the Tourney. George R.R. Martin set the scene well enough with the fan theory R+L J, so it may be that he had another theory waiting to be uncovered. So, what do you think? Are Ned Stark and his family responsible for the coming of the Night King by not leaving a Stark in Winterfell during the events of the Tourney? Did Bran the Builder infuse Winterfell with magic that tied it to the Stark lineage? Or is this just a stretch by taking some key information found in the books and shows and making assumptions? Let us know what you think of the theory, and what your own theory is. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more videos like this in your playlist every day. Thanks for watching.